Earth stayed silent, until the Galaxy Council crossed the line of disrespect. The claw came down before I finished my third sentence. I had been speaking for 42 seconds. 42 seconds out of the 10 minutes allotted to Earth's advisory submission on the Kalaran Trade Corridor dispute. The Voth delegate, a creature named Soreth, who stood 2.5 meters tall and had never once looked at a human being with anything resembling interest, reached across the holographic dais and flicked the data chip I had placed there off the edge. It fell into the air recycling duct below the council floor. Gone. The proposal I had spent 4 months preparing, gone. Laughter moved through the chamber like a slow wave. Not all of it was cruel. Some of it was just the kind of laughter that comes when everyone in the room agrees, without saying it, that the smallest person present has made an embarrassing mistake by trying to speak at all. I closed my mouth. I sat down. I picked up my pen and wrote the time, the date, and a single sentence in my notebook. I have been doing this for 11 years. The Galactic Council Chamber sits at the center of Valindra Station, which orbits a cold blue star in a system so far from Earth that the light leaving our sun right now will not reach it for 600 years. The chamber itself is enormous. It holds 912 delegate seats arranged in a curved arc, and at the center of that arc is the dais where the real decisions are made. I sat 40 rows back, in a section marked with a pale gray stripe along the armrest. Gray stripe meant observer. Observer meant you had no vote, no formal standing, and no right to speak unless the chair granted it. The chair granted it to Earth occasionally, the way you might occasionally let a child say something at the dinner table, not because you expected wisdom, but because it was easier than listening to them knock their fork against their plate. My name is Mira Vasquez. I have been Earth's permanent delegate to the Galactic Council for 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days. Before me, the position was held by a man named Jeffrey Oakes, who held it for 6 years before his health gave out. Before Jeffrey, a woman named Nora Ellison, who held it for 9 years and returned to Earth without a single formal victory to her name. I used to read Nora's reports late at night, when the station went quiet and the cleaning drones hummed through the corridors. She wrote with a kind of exhausted honesty that I found more useful than any diplomatic manual. One entry, near the end of her tenure, read simply, "They do not see us." And until they do, everything we say lands the same way a stone lands when you drop it into deep water. It makes a sound. Nobody comes to look. I understood what she meant the first week I arrived. The Voth Collective controls roughly 40% of the settled galaxy by volume. They have 17 full voting seats on the council, the most of any single species, and they use those seats the way a large person uses their body in a crowded hallway. They do not move around you. You move around them. Soreth, the delegate who had just discarded my proposal, was not even the senior Voth representative. He was third in their delegation. The fact that he had felt comfortable enough to dismiss a human submission with a casual flick of his claw in front of 900 witnesses without even a sideways glance at his superiors for approval told me everything I needed to know about how far Earth had to go. The Relian conclave occupied the seats immediately adjacent to the Voth. They were a thinner species, pale and elongated, with large dark eyes that moved independently, and a reputation for reading emotional states without asking permission. The Relian did not laugh at the dismissal of my proposal. They simply watched me, the way you might watch a dog trying to open a door, interested, in a distant way, waiting to see if the animal would figure it out or give up. Their lead delegate, a woman named Yasara, who had held her position for what translated to roughly 40 Earth years, had spoken to me exactly twice in 11 years. The first time, she had asked me what humans ate. The second time, she had corrected my pronunciation of a Relian greeting during a diplomatic function. Neither conversation had lasted longer than a minute. I did not take this personally. That was the first lesson Jeffrey Oakes's notes had taught me, and the most important one. You could not afford to take it personally. The moment you made it about your feelings, you lost the thread of what actually mattered. and what actually mattered was not whether Soreth respected me. What mattered was what Earth was doing while Soreth was busy not respecting me. I turned to the page in my notebook where I kept my running count. 31 years since Earth's admission to the Galactic Council as a non-voting observer state. 28 years since the first Earth-flagged cargo vessel completed a transit through the Kalaran corridor under Voth-controlled navigation codes. 19 years since the Joint Scientific Exchange Program with the Teleri allowed Earth's bioengineering division to develop what our own researchers had estimated would take another 40 years to discover independently. 14 years since Earth's quiet orbital expansion passed a threshold that, if anyone on the Council had been paying attention, would have raised serious questions about our long-term intentions. Nobody had been paying attention. 11 years since I sat down in this gray-striped seat and started writing everything down. The trade corridor session continued around me. A Voth economic minister presented revised toll structures. A Relian mediator offered language adjustments to a proposed shipping treaty. 3 smaller species, the Teleri, the Oan, and the quiet, beetle-like Messin, raised concerns through their observers and were heard with the polite patience that people show when they have already decided the answer and are simply waiting for the question to finish. I watched all of it. I wrote down all of it. There is a particular kind of patience that Earth developed over a very long history of being in situations where we were not the most powerful party in the room. We had practice, centuries of it. Civilizations that survived, not because they were the strongest in any given moment, but because they understood that moments pass, and what you do with the time between moments is what determines who is still standing when the next one arrives. The Council did not know this about us. They had looked at our planet, our single inhabited world, our modest fleet of civilian transports and research vessels, our observer badge and our gray-striped seats, and they had made an assessment. Small, young, harmless, probably temporary. They had never asked what we were doing with the time. After the session closed, I walked back to the Earth delegation suite through a corridor that smelled of recycled air and machine oil. The suite was 3 rooms, an office, a conference space, and a narrow sleeping quarters I had occupied for so long that the mattress had molded to the shape of my back. On the wall of the office, I had pinned a physical map of the council chamber. Every seat was marked. The voting blocks were color-coded in ink I had applied myself, updated every 6 months as alliances shifted. Alongside each delegation's name, I had written a number. That number represented the count of formal slights, procedural dismissals, and deliberate exclusions directed at Earth or at any observer species that I had personally witnessed and documented since my arrival. The number next to the Voth entry had just increased by 1. I set my notebook on the desk. I opened my secure communication terminal. There was a message waiting from the Secretary General's office. Standard debrief request. Nothing urgent. Below it, a message from the Earth Orbital Coordination Bureau, marked with the low-priority flag we used for updates that contained no actionable news but needed to be logged. I opened it anyway. It contained a single line of technical data, a fleet readiness update, routine. Except it was not routine, because I knew the code embedded in the formatting, and what it told me was that the 3rd phase of a project that had been running quietly for 9 years had just completed its final calibration. I read the line twice. Then I closed the terminal and sat in my chair for a long time. Outside the small porthole above my desk, the stars moved slowly as the station rotated. Somewhere in that direction, too far to see, was Earth, turning and busy and entirely unbothered by how it was perceived out here, because it had stopped worrying about perception a long time ago and started worrying about capability instead. I picked up my pen again, opened to a new page. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote Soreth's name and the description of what he had done and the exact wording of the laughter that had followed. I wrote the technical code from the fleet update and its meaning. Then, below all of that, I wrote 2 words that I had been waiting 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days to write. Begin preparations. I folded the notebook closed, pressed my palm flat against the cover for a moment, the way you might press your hand against a door before walking through it. Then I went to bed, because tomorrow there were 3 more sessions, and I was going to be present for every single one of them. The next morning arrived the way mornings always did on Velindra Station. Not with sunlight, because there were no windows in my sleeping quarters, but with a soft chime from the environmental system and a gradual brightening of the wall panels that someone had once told me was calibrated to simulate a natural dawn. It did not simulate a natural dawn. It simulated a slightly orange rectangle getting less dark. But after 11 years, it was what I knew, so it was what I used to begin each day. I dressed. I ate. I checked my notebook to confirm that what I had written the night before had not been some kind of late evening mistake brought on by too much recycled coffee and accumulated frustration. It had not been a mistake. I clipped my observer badge to my jacket. The badge was a small disc, gray around the rim, Earth's designation code printed in galactic standard along the bottom. Every time I put it on, I was aware of its weight in a way that had nothing to do with its actual mass, which was negligible. I was aware of what it represented, the small seat, the gray stripe, the non-vote that nonetheless showed up in the record as Earth's presence, year after year, patient and noted, and completely underestimated. I walked out of the suite, into the corridor, and toward the chamber. The day's first session was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. It was a routine administrative hearing about membership fee assessments for the new solar cycle. I had read the agenda the night before. Nowhere on that agenda was Earth mentioned. Nowhere on that agenda did Earth need to be mentioned. But I had sent 17 messages the night before, to 17 different contacts among the smaller observer delegations, and I was curious to see how many of them would arrive at the session slightly early and position themselves in the seats closest to the floor microphone. 12 of them did. I allowed myself a small, quiet feeling of satisfaction, the kind that does not show on the face. Then I opened my notebook to the next clean page and began to write. The message arrived without warning, the way the worst ones always do. I was in the middle of reviewing trade flow data for the Kelaran corridor when my terminal flagged a council priority transmission. Priority transmissions were rare. In 11 years, I had received 4 of them. The first was the announcement of a new council chair. The second was a system-wide emergency alert about debris from a failed deep space relay. The third and fourth were both administrative errors that someone had marked incorrectly. I opened this one with the same measured caution I applied to everything, because caution had served me better than reaction every single time. It took me 11 seconds to read it. Proposal 7 Alpha 9, reclassification of Observer State Earth from Standard Observer Status to Dependent Protectorate, effective pending full Council ratification. Pending ratification, all Earth-flagged military development proposals to require Committee of 7 approval. All Earth foreign policy communications to be filed through the Voth-chaired Interspecies Oversight Board. Ratification vote scheduled 43 standard days from this transmission. I read it again, then a third time. Then I set the terminal down very carefully, stood up, walked to my small porthole, and looked at the stars for approximately 2 minutes without moving. A dependent protectorate was not a demotion. It was a cage. The language was diplomatic, the way all cages are built with polished bars rather than rough ones, but the function was identical. Every ship Earth built, every treaty Earth negotiated, every message Earth sent to another species would have to pass through a committee chaired by the Voth before it could be acted upon. We would have less independent authority than we had possessed before we ever joined the Council. We would, in the language of galactic politics, become property. The proposal had 12 co-signatories. 10 were Voth-aligned. The other 2 were species I had never heard of before, minor voting members with small populations and enormous debts to the Voth collective. The political math was clear. With 17 Voth seats and their allied votes, the proposal was already at 51%. It would pass unless something changed, and it would pass in 43 days. I sat back down. I had always known this moment might come. Geoffrey Oakes had warned of it in his notes, buried in a paragraph near the end of his second year. He had written, "The risk is not that they ignore us forever. The risk is that one day they notice us just enough to want to control us, and do it before we are ready." Nora Ellison had written something similar, more bluntly. "The day they decide we are useful is more dangerous than the day they decide we are harmless." I had prepared for this, not in the way that people prepare for things when they are afraid of them, but in the way that I had prepared for 11 years, slowly and carefully, and without telling anyone who did not need to know. I opened a drawer in my desk and removed a second notebook. This one was not the daily log I carried everywhere. This one was older, the cover worn smooth from handling, the pages dense with small, precise writing that I had added to over the course of a decade. I called it, in my own head, the long document. It had no official name. It was not filed anywhere in Earth's diplomatic records. It existed in two places, in this drawer and in an encrypted partition on a server in a building in Wellington, New Zealand, that was registered to a property management company and had never once been searched by anyone. The long document was, at its core, a legal argument. 612 pages of it, cross-referenced against the founding charter of the Galactic Council, 31 years of council session transcripts, 47 secondary statutes, and 9 precedent cases from council history in which observer states had successfully challenged procedural decisions. I had started writing it in my third year, when I began to understand the architecture of council law well enough to see where the load-bearing walls were. I had continued writing it every time the council revealed another mechanism that could be turned against itself. Proposal 7 Alpha 9 violated 17 of those statutes. I had spent that morning, the morning after reading the transmission, going through the document page by page to confirm it. By the afternoon, I was certain. But the legal argument alone was not enough. I had learned early that being right in the council chamber meant very little if you were right alone. The chamber ran on weight, numbers, the visible accumulation of support. A single species standing up to say that a proposal was illegal was a complaint. 30 species standing up to say it was a coordinated challenge. What I needed, and what I had been quietly building for a decade, was the 30. I opened my communications panel and began sending messages. The Teleri were the first I reached out to. Their lead delegate was a man named Corvell, small in the way his species were small, with wide amber eyes and the kind of careful speech that came from years of saying the right thing to the wrong people, in the hope that one day someone with actual power would listen. I had met Corvell 8 years ago at a routine session where neither of our species had any reason to be, and we had sat beside each other in the observer gallery because the seats were assigned alphabetically and Earth came before Teleri. We had talked for 6 hours. I had told him nothing about my plans. He had told me nothing about his. We had discovered, in the careful, indirect way that diplomats discover things about each other, that we were both taking very long views of our situations. When I messaged him that night, his reply came back in 4 minutes. "I already heard. I was hoping you would reach out. Tell me what you need." The OAN sent a similar reply. The Messin took longer, their communication style being more deliberate, but when the answer came, it was unambiguous. I reached out to 23 other observer-tier species over the following 72 hours. Some I knew well, some I had only exchanged formal courtesies with over years of shared gallery seating. A few I was contacting for the first time on any matter of substance. All 41 who responded said yes. The 42nd and 43rd confirmations arrived from species I had never expected, the Vel, a minor voting member who owed the Voth nothing and had spent 30 years watching their own influence shrink as the Voth consolidated power, and the Dressi, a species of extraordinary linguistic sophistication who had been locked out of full membership on a procedural technicality for 22 years and had not forgotten it. Neither of them were observer states. Both of them were voting members. And both of them had just told me, in different words, that they were tired. 43 signatures on a joint formal objection was not the same as 43 votes. Most of my allies had no votes. But 43 signatures on a legal challenge to a proposal's procedural validity, filed under Article 12 of the Council's own founding charter, was enough to trigger a mandatory review period, and a mandatory review period meant the 43-day clock stopped. I wrote the filing myself. It took 9 days. I worked on it during sessions, during meals, during the hours after the station's environmental system dimmed its wall panels to simulate the dark part of the rectangle. I pulled from the long document extensively, but I rewrote everything in the formal language of council submissions, stripped of personality, dense with citation, constructed so that any legal mind in the galaxy reading it would see immediately that the argument was not a complaint, it was a case. On the 15th day, after receiving the priority transmission, I filed it. The Council's administrative office acknowledged receipt within the hour. Automatic, no personality involved. But 2 hours after that, I received a direct message from the chair's office. The message asked, in the careful language of people who are not quite alarmed but are no longer completely comfortable, whether Earth's delegation would be available for an informal clarification session at its earliest convenience. I wrote back that we would be delighted to make time. Then I opened my secure terminal and sent a message to the Secretary General's office on Earth. It was short. 3 sentences. I described what had happened, what I had done, and what I anticipated happening next. The 3rd sentence was a request, not for instruction, but for authority. I needed to know that if this went further than legal arguments, if it escalated to something that would require demonstrating more than words, Earth was prepared to support it. The reply came back in 6 hours, which was fast given the communication delay between Valindra Station and Earth. It had been signed personally by the Secretary General, a man named Adrian Cole who had been in office for 3 years and who I had met exactly once, at the ceremony marking his appointment. I had found him direct in the way that people are direct when they have not yet learned to be afraid of the truth. His reply was 4 words. "You have full authority." I printed it out, which was something I almost never did. I folded the paper and put it in the long document, between the section on Article 12 and the section on Charter Amendments. Then I went to find Corvell. He was in the observer gallery, as he usually was in the evenings, watching the empty chamber the way people watch places where important things are about to happen. I sat beside him. We were quiet for a while. He said, eventually, that his people had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Not this specific moment, but the kind of moment where something that had been building quietly beneath the surface finally came up into the light. I told him I understood that feeling. He asked me if I was ready. I looked at the empty chamber, at the dais where Soreth had flicked my proposal into the air duct, at the gray-striped seats in the observer section, 40 rows back, where I had spent 11 years writing in notebooks and being invisible. I told him that I had been ready for a while. I had just been waiting for them to give me a reason. He nodded slowly. Then he said something in his own language that I had learned to translate years ago. It meant, approximately, the river does not announce itself before it reaches the sea. I wrote it in my notebook when I got back to the suite. Then I slept for 8 hours, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep I had managed in 4 months. Tomorrow, the 43-day clock had stopped. The mandatory review was in effect. And somewhere in the Voth delegation's suite, someone was reading a 612-page legal filing and beginning to understand that the gray stripe section was not as empty as it had always looked. I found that thought very comfortable. 3 days into the mandatory review period, the informal clarification session took place in a small conference room adjacent to the main chamber. The room was designed for conversations that did not need to be recorded. Beige walls, a low oval table, 6 chairs. I arrived first, which I had intended. Arriving first meant you chose your seat, and the seat I chose was the one with a clear line of sight to the door and my back to the wall. 11 years of watching how rooms work had made me particular about these things. The chair's office sent a representative named Wool, a Relian administrator in his middle years, composed in the way that Relian officials were always composed, as though any show of feeling would be a professional failure. He was accompanied by a Voth legal counsel named Prethik, who was younger than Soreth and carried the particular tension of someone who had been handed a problem they had not expected to encounter. Wool opened by saying that the council appreciated Earth's commitment to procedural engagement. I said that Earth appreciated having its submissions reviewed on their merits. A pause followed that was not quite comfortable. Prethik asked whether Earth understood that the Protectorate classification was intended as a supportive framework, designed to assist developing civilizations in navigating the complexities of galactic membership. I said that I understood the stated intention perfectly. I also said that Earth's legal team had identified 17 ways in which the proposal's actual text diverged from that stated intention, and that the filing I had submitted outlined each divergence with chapter and clause citation. I set a paper copy of the summary index on the table. It was 43 pages long, which was just the index. Wool looked at the paper, then he looked at me. I held his gaze. He said that the council's legal office would require time to conduct its own analysis. I said that was completely expected, and that the mandatory review period existed precisely for that purpose. We sat in that room for another 40 minutes. Almost nothing of substance was said by either of them. What was said was the language of people who came in expecting to find a manageable complaint and had found, instead, a structure, something built with intention, over a long time, using their own tools. When it was over, I walked back to the Earth suite. I made myself a cup of tea using leaves I had brought from home in a sealed container that I had been refilling through the resupply network for 11 years, because some things were non-negotiable, and good tea was one of them. I sat in my chair and looked at the wall map of the council chamber. Then I picked up my secure terminal and called Corvell. I told him the meeting had gone exactly the way it was supposed to go. He asked what that meant. I told him it meant that for the first time in 31 years, Earth's position in this station had shifted from something they could ignore to something they had to address. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he would tell his people. I told him to tell them carefully. The day of the Protectorate ratification session arrived the way all the sessions I had most needed to attend had arrived. Too early, with too much riding on it, and with no one in the wider chamber expecting anything unusual. I was in my seat 30 minutes before the opening chime. My notebook was open, my pen was uncapped. I had slept 5 hours, which was not enough and was also completely fine, because the kind of alertness I needed today did not come from sleep. It came from 11 years of patience that had finally run out of reasons to wait. The chamber filled gradually. 912 seats were not always occupied at routine sessions, but today the attendance was high, partly because the Protectorate vote was on the schedule and everyone expected it to be quick, and partly because word had moved through the station in the quiet, invisible way that words always move through places where people live in close quarters, and everyone knows everyone else's business at least a little. Something was different today. The gray-striped section was full for the first time in memory. Soreth arrived with the rest of the Voth delegation and settled into his seat with the easy confidence of a man who expected nothing to surprise him. He did not look at the observer section. He never did. Ysara took her seat among the Relian. She did look at the observer section, briefly. Her dark eyes moved across it once, stopped for a fraction of a second at my position, and moved on. I noted it without reacting. The session opened with standard formalities. The chair, a tall and unhurried Gravali named Austin, whose reputation for impartiality was the most genuinely respected thing about the council's administration, read the day's agenda. trade resolutions, infrastructure allocations, and, third on the list, the ratification vote on Proposal 7 Alpha 9. The first two items moved through in 40 minutes. I watched and wrote. When Austin reached the third item, he read the proposal number and its title and then added, without any particular emphasis, that the mandatory review period had concluded and that the Council's legal office had submitted its analysis, which had been distributed to all delegation heads the previous evening. The VOTH legal counsel, Prethik, was on his feet almost immediately. He said that the Council's legal office had found no substantive procedural barrier to ratification and that the VOTH delegation moved to proceed with the vote. Austin acknowledged the motion. Then he asked whether any delegation wished to speak before the vote was called. In 11 years, I had never requested the floor. Observers did not request the floor. It was not forbidden, technically, the way many things in galactic politics were not technically forbidden, but were so thoroughly understood to be outside the expected order of things, that doing them felt like a minor act of transgression. The gray-striped section did not speak. The gray-striped section watched. I raised my hand. The chamber did not go immediately quiet. It went through a brief phase of confused murmuring, the way a large crowd goes when it sees something that does not fit the pattern it has been watching. Then it went quiet. Austin looked at me. He had the face of someone who was processing new information calmly, because calm processing was what he was paid for. After a moment, he said that he recognized the representative from Earth. I stood. I was aware of the weight of the room, in a physical sense. 912 seats of eyes, plus the technical staff, plus the recording devices that captured every session for the archive, plus the feed that was transmitted to the observation lounges where delegation's support staff could follow the proceedings. All of it, in that moment, aimed at a human being in a gray-striped seat 40 rows back who had just stood up for the first time. I said, clearly, and at a pace that I had practiced until it was both natural and impossible to misunderstand, that Earth formally objected to Proposal 7 Alpha 9 on 17 counts of procedural violation, and that in accordance with Article 12 of the Council's founding charter, Earth requested that those violations be entered into the session record before any vote was conducted. Prethik said that the Council's legal office had already reviewed the filing and found no barrier to ratification. I said that I was aware of the legal office's finding and that I had, with respect, prepared a response to that finding, which I would now like to present. Austin asked how long the presentation would take. I said approximately 40 minutes. The murmuring came back, louder this time. Soreth said something in Voth that the translation system rendered as a question about whether an observer had standing to make such a presentation. It was a fair procedural question, and the fact that it was being asked out loud rather than through proper channels meant that Soreth had not expected to need to ask it. He had expected the vote to be called and concluded before I could do anything more complicated than object. Austin consulted the charter text on his dais terminal. He took his time. The chamber was very quiet while he did this. He said that under Article 8, Section 4 of the Founding Charter, any registered council member, including observer states, had the right to submit formal legal challenges to proposals under active mandatory review, and that a presentation of those challenges in open session fell within that right. He said that Earth's request was granted. I walked to the speaker's platform at the front of the chamber. I had been to the speaker's platform before, twice, both times to deliver the brief courtesy remarks that observers were occasionally invited to give on topics of minor relevance. Both times I had spoken for under 3 minutes. The platform had a slight elevation above the main floor, and from it you could see all 912 seats at once. I had thought, when I stood there before, that it was a strange design for a room meant to make speakers feel important, because what it actually did was make you very aware of how many people were looking at you. Today, I found that awareness useful. I did not bring the full 612-page document to the platform. I brought a 40-page summary, a set of citation references, and a data chip containing the legal analysis in full, which I placed on the speaker's dais as I had been placing data chips on that dais for 11 years, the difference being that this time I placed it slowly and deliberately and watched to make sure it registered. Then I began. I spoke for 43 minutes. I know it was 43 because I had timed it carefully and because I kept one eye on the chamber chronometer throughout. I spoke without raising my voice. I spoke in Galactic Standard, which I had learned to a level of fluency that occasionally surprised people who assumed humans were still calibrating to the language. I cited 17 specific provisions of Council founding law. I cited 8 precedents from Council history. I cited the Council's own legal office's analysis, not to agree with it, but to demonstrate, section by section, where its conclusions had failed to account for the precedent cases. At around the 12-minute mark, I noticed that Yasara had stopped looking at me, the way she had looked at me at the diplomatic function when she corrected my pronunciation. She was now looking at me the way she looked at things she was actually thinking about. At around the 20-minute mark, I noticed that the Relian legal scholars in the gallery seats above the main floor had begun writing, not the passive notation of people following a session, the rapid, concentrated writing of people encountering an argument they had not seen before and needed to work through. At around the 30-minute mark, I placed a second data chip on the dais. I explained, in the same measured tone I had used for the previous 30 minutes, that this chip contained Earth's complete assessment of every current Council member state: economic, military, technological, political. The assessment had been compiled over 31 years of observation and was current as of 14 days ago. It was detailed. It was accurate. I knew it was accurate because accuracy had been the non-negotiable standard of everything Earth had done since we arrived in this chamber and decided that the only asset we had that no one could take from us was being right. I said that Earth was not presenting this assessment as a threat. I said it carefully and I meant it. I said that Earth was presenting it as evidence. Evidence that we had been paying attention. Evidence that the entity this chamber had been treating as a minor, temporary, harmless presence for 31 years had been studying them with exactly the same systematic patience they had never thought to apply to us. I said that Earth did not want control. We did not want dominance. We wanted what we had earned the right to demand, to be treated as what we were, which was a sovereign civilization that had accepted observer status in good faith and had honored every obligation that status carried, and which was not going to accept reclassification into a condition of political subordination simply because it was convenient for parties who had never found us interesting enough to take seriously until we became inconvenient. I said that Proposal 7 Alpha 9 was illegal under the Council's own founding documents, that the Council's legal office had made an error it could and should correct, and that Earth was formally requesting a full chamber review of that error before any vote was conducted. Then I picked up both data chips and placed them side by side on the edge of the dais. I said that both of these were available for the record. Then I said thank you, and I walked back to my seat. The chamber did not react the way chambers react in stories. Nobody stood. Nobody applauded. The Voth delegation did not dramatically walk out. What happened was a kind of dense, pressurized silence that lasted for approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long silence in a room with 912 people in it, and then Austin said that the chamber would take a 40-minute recess. I sat in my gray-striped seat and wrote in my notebook. Soreth had still not looked at me, but I noticed, when the recess was called and the delegates began to move and converse, that he did not immediately turn to his delegation the way he usually did. He sat. He was looking at something in the middle distance that was not the chamber and was not me and was not anything I could identify. He sat that way for almost 2 minutes before his senior colleague leaned over and spoke to him. I wrote that down too. During the recess, Corvell found me in the corridor outside the chamber entrance. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at me with an expression that I had learned, over 8 years, was his equivalent of being overwhelmed. Then he said that he had never seen anything like it. I told him that was somewhat the point. He asked what would happen next. I told him that the council's legal office would spend the next several days doing what it should have done in the first place, and that when they did it properly this time, they would find that I was right, and that finding would give Austin the procedural ground he needed to table the vote indefinitely. I said that the Voth would push back, but that pushing back against a charter-valid legal objection in a chamber where the objection was now on the record and the data chip was in the archive was a very different political calculation from dismissing a non-voting observer. Corvell asked if I was certain. I thought about Jeffrey Oakes's notes, about Nora Ellison's, about 11 years of writing in notebooks and 11 years of being a stone dropped into deep water, making a sound, waiting for someone to come look. I told him that I was certain about the law. About what came after the law, I told him, we would have to wait and see. He nodded. We walked back inside. The vote on Proposal 7 Alpha 9 was tabled indefinitely, pending full chamber legal review. The announcement was made at the end of the recess in the same neutral tone Austin used for everything, as though the council had not just been stopped in its tracks by the species with the gray-striped seats. I closed my notebook. I allowed myself exactly 5 seconds to feel everything I had been storing up for 11 years and 4 months and 17 days. Then I opened it again and started the next page. There was still a great deal of work to do. That evening, I sat in the small common area that the lower-ranked observer delegations shared on the station's 14th level. It was not a glamorous space. The chairs were old, and the table in the middle had a scratch across one end that had been there since before I arrived, but the delegates who used it were not glamorous people, and the conversations that happened around that table were, I had long believed, the most honest conversations on the entire station. Corvell was there. So was Nell, the Owen delegation's primary representative, a quiet and observant person with the kind of stillness that made you notice whenever she decided to speak. So was Bren, the young Messon delegate who had arrived 2 years ago and was still in the stage of trying to reconcile what galactic diplomacy was supposed to look like with what it actually looked like. We sat together, all 4 of us, and nobody said much for a while. The station hummed around us. Bren asked me what I had felt when I walked to the speaker's platform. I thought about it. I told him that I had felt very little. Not because I was not affected by it, but because I had spent 11 years learning how to keep feeling separate from function, and by this point the habit was so deeply set that the feeling tended to arrive later, after the work was done, when it was safe to let it. He asked when later was. I said probably tonight, in about 2 hours, when I was back in my quarters and the tea was cooling and there was no one watching. Nell smiled at that. It was a small smile, the kind that people make when they recognize something true. Corvell said that his people had a word for the kind of action I had taken today. He said it did not translate well, but the closest English equivalent was something like the sound before thunder, the thing that arrives before the big thing, which seems small until you understand that everything that follows comes from it. I wrote the phrase in my notebook. I told him that I liked it. We talked for a while longer about practical matters, the legal review timeline, the likely response from the Voth delegation in the coming days, which of our allied species had the most to gain from pushing for formal membership hearings under the precedent I had now established. The Vel and the Dressy, both of whom had voted against the protectorate proposal in the initial committee reading, wanted to meet. I would meet them tomorrow. When the common area emptied out and I walked back to my suite, I made tea. I sat down. The tea cooled. And then, because the work was done for that particular day, I let myself feel it. I thought about the 43 minutes at the speaker's platform. I thought about the silence afterward. I thought about Soreth staring into the middle distance. I thought about the Relian legal scholars writing quickly in their gallery seats. I thought about the data chip in the archive, our 31 years of careful observation now locked into the formal record where it could never be dismissed or flicked off a dais. I thought about Jeffrey Oakes and Nora Ellison, and I hoped that wherever their versions of the long view had eventually taken them, they could sense that someone had followed the thread they left. Then I washed my cup. I lay down. And I slept for 9 hours, which was the longest I had slept in 11 years. By the 6th day after the ratification session, I had received 47 requests for private meetings. This was more requests than I had received in my entire previous 11 years combined. The breakdown was instructive. 19 requests came from observer-tier species who had followed the session from the gallery and wanted to know if the legal framework I had used could apply to their own situations. 14 came from minor voting members who were, in the careful language of diplomatic outreach, expressing interest in strengthening bilateral ties with Earth. 8 came from neutral parties, mediators, and administrative staff who had questions that were technically procedural, but were actually just people trying to understand what had changed and how quickly it was going to keep changing. 4 came from the Relian Conclave. 2 came from offices aligned with the Voth Collective. None of those 2 identified themselves as Voth directly. They did not need to. I scheduled the 19 observer-tier meetings first. They were the people who mattered most and who had the least access to anyone who would listen to them, which was a situation I understood personally. I met them in groups, 5 or 6 at a time, in the 14th level common room where the chairs were old and the table had a scratch along one end. I told them clearly what I had done, how I had done it, and which elements of the approach were specific to Earth's situation and which were generalizable. I answered their questions directly. When their questions revealed something I had not considered, I wrote it down and told them I would think about it. The Teleri asked whether the precedent I had established could be used to challenge the membership fee structure that had kept observer states in a cycle of financial dependency. I told them that I believed it could, and that if they wanted to bring a formal challenge, I would help them draft it. The Messin asked whether Earth intended to pursue full voting membership now. I said that was Earth's decision to make through its own political process, and that I had already forwarded my recommendation, which was yes. The Oan asked what Earth wanted in return for all of this. I told them the truth, nothing that they could not give freely and that would not cost them anything to give. Respect, honestly applied, a council that worked the way it was written to work. The understanding that small did not mean unimportant. Nell, sitting across the table, said that those seemed like reasonable things to want. I said that I had always thought so. On the 9th day, I met with the Vel delegate. Her name was Hannah, which was a coincidence I appreciated since it was the name of my grandmother, though the similarity ended there. The Vel Hannah was tall, formal, and had the bearing of someone who had been angry about the same things for a very long time, and had found a way to carry that anger without letting it show except in the precision of her speech. She told me that the Vel had been watching Earth's strategy for the past 3 years. She said watching because she understood that there had been a strategy even before I had confirmed it. She said that the Vel had chosen not to intervene before now because they had not believed the moment would come in time to matter. She was, she said, glad to have been wrong. I asked what the Vel wanted. She said that the Vel wanted the council to work. Not to work for the Voth, not to work for the Relian, to work as it was designed to work, which it had not done in a very long time. I said that was also what Earth wanted. We talked for 2 hours. At the end, she extended her hand in the human fashion, which she had clearly looked up, and I shook it. On the 11th day, the Relian made their move. An envoy arrived at my suite, not Yasara, but a senior aide named Pell, who had been with the conclave delegation for many years, and who spoke in the layered way that Relian used when they were trying to say something difficult without saying it directly. He offered refreshment, which I declined. He asked whether I was comfortable, which I said I was. He arranged himself in the chair across from my desk and began. The Relian conclave, he said, recognized the significance of Earth's contribution to council jurisprudence. The Earth delegation's legal analysis had identified genuine gaps in the Council's procedural framework, and the conclave felt that those gaps deserved to be addressed through a comprehensive review process. The conclave would be willing to support Earth's formal request for such a review. He paused. In exchange, he said, the conclave hoped that Earth might be willing to consider whether certain materials that had recently entered the Council archive might be more appropriately classified at a restricted access level. I looked at him for a moment. I said that I assumed he was referring to the data chip I had placed on the speaker's dais. He said that was indeed what he was referring to. I said that the chip had been submitted as formal evidence in a legal proceeding and was therefore public record under Council Charter. He said that Charter provisions sometimes allowed for reclassification in cases where the material was sensitive in nature. I said that I was aware of those provisions, and that I had consulted them before submitting the chip, and that the material did not qualify for reclassification under any of the applicable criteria. A silence followed. Then I said that I had made 3 copies, which I hoped was not distressing to hear, but which I felt in good conscience I should mention. Pell maintained his expression very professionally. He thanked me for my time. He left. I sat with my tea for a while. The attempt had been predictable. What was interesting was what it revealed. The Relian were not worried about the legal argument. They were worried about what was in that chip, what their rivals knew about them, or could infer. What Earth had seen in 40 years of careful watching that the Relian had assumed was invisible. The answer, of course, was quite a lot. On the 14th day, the Voth made their move, not through an envoy, through economic action. A notice went out through official trade channels that 3 shipping routes passing through Voth-controlled navigation sectors had their access codes modified, effective immediately. 2 of those routes were heavily used by Earth-flagged cargo transports. The third served 4 of our allied observer species. The notice described the change as a routine security review. It was not a routine security review. It was a test, a pressure point, a way of saying, without saying it, that certain things could be made difficult for Earth if Earth continued to be difficult. I received the notice at the same time as the Secretary General's office and the Earth Orbital Coordination Bureau. I sent a message to both within the hour, along with my analysis and my recommendation. My recommendation was to do nothing immediately. Wait 24 hours. Watch what happened. What happened was this. Within 18 hours of the navigation access change, 12 species began rerouting their shipping through Earth-coordinated jump points. These were points that Earth had been quietly developing for 9 years. They were more efficient than the Voth routes by approximately 12%, which was a number I had put in a report to the Secretary General 7 years ago, and which had resulted in budget approval for the second phase of the construction program. The 12 species using the new routes were not doing so as a political statement. They were doing so because it was faster and cheaper, which was the most sustainable kind of loyalty. Within 48 hours, the Voth had lost more in transit fee revenue than the blocked routes would have cost Earth in a standard year of operations. Within 72 hours, the access codes were quietly restored to their previous configuration. No announcement was made. No apology was issued. The Voth simply opened the door they had closed and did not comment on it. I received a message from the Secretary General's office that day. Adrian Cole wrote only, "Noted with interest." I replied, "There is more where that came from." On the 17th day, Corvell came to find me again. He was moving differently than he usually did. Not faster exactly, but with a kind of contained energy that I recognized as excitement he was being careful with. He told me that his government had formally applied for a membership hearing upgrade, citing the legal framework from the ratification session as grounds. He told me that the OAN had filed the same day. He told me that 9 other observer species were in the process of preparing similar filings, and that his government had been fielding calls from 3 additional species who had not previously been in contact with the Teleri about anything of political substance. He told me that something was happening that he did not entirely have words for, and that he wanted to know if I had words for it. I said that I thought the word was momentum. He repeated the word quietly, testing it. I said that there was something else I wanted to tell him. I had received confirmation that morning of something I had been waiting on. The 43 Allied signatures on our original filing had now grown to 61. Not because I had been asking people to sign, because people had been asking to sign. Corville sat down in the chair across from my desk. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said that his people had a word for this too. He said it in Teleri, which I did not ask him to translate, because sometimes the right response to something important is not to immediately convert it into your own language, but to let it exist in the form it came in. I wrote it in my notebook in the way he said it, phonetically, and drew a small box around it. I made us both tea. We sat in my office on a space station orbiting a cold blue star, 600 light-years from the sun, whose light would not reach us for centuries, and we talked about what came next. There was quite a lot that came next. The days that followed moved with an intensity that was different from the intensity of waiting. Waiting had been slow. This was fast, and the difference in pace required a different kind of management. I started keeping 2 notebooks simultaneously, which I had never done before, one for the ongoing daily record and one specifically for tracking the Alliance network and its expanding connections. By the end of the 3rd week, I had met with representatives from 67 species. Not all of them were allies. Some were observers of a different kind, assessing which direction things were heading before they decided where to stand. I was not bothered by this. Patience applied to people as well as to situations. Bren, the young Messin delegate, had become a regular fixture in the 14th level common room. He was diligent and careful and had a quality I had noticed in the best diplomats regardless of species. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, it was because he had something worth saying. He came to me one afternoon with a document he had prepared, a mapping of the Council's procedural rules that identified 4 additional areas where observer states had unused legal rights that had simply never been exercised because no one had exercised them before. It was excellent work. I told him so, and I meant it. He asked, with the directness that characterized his species, whether I had always planned for the response to be this large. I told him honestly that I had planned for the legal argument. I had hoped for the Alliance response. I had not dared to predict the scale. Some things, I said, you can only plan up to a certain point. After that point, what matters is that you built the foundation correctly, because you cannot control what stands on it, but you can make sure it does not collapse. He thought about this for a while. Then he said that Earth must be a very unusual planet. I considered that. I thought about Earth's history, its long, complicated, frequently painful history of people fighting each other and learning from it, and fighting again, and learning more. I thought about what that history had produced, in terms of the kind of tenacity that makes you sit in a gray-striped seat for 11 years and keep writing in a notebook. I told him that Earth was not unusual. I told him that every species with a difficult enough history eventually learned what Earth had learned. It just depended on how many chances the universe gave you to apply the lesson. He wrote that down. I found, around this time, that I was sleeping better. Not because the situation was less demanding, but because the quality of the demand had changed. For 11 years, the effort had been invisible. Everything I built had to be built in the understanding that no one would acknowledge it, and possibly no one would ever know. That kind of work is sustainable, but it is also lonely in a way that is hard to articulate. What was happening now was still work, and it was harder in some practical senses, but it was work that other people could see. And being seen, after that long in the gray stripe, turned out to matter more than I had let myself admit. The Reformed Council's inaugural restructuring session was held 63 days after I had stood at the speaker's platform and placed 2 data chips on the dais. In those 63 days, the Council's legal office had completed its full review and confirmed, in a document that was considerably less comfortable in its language than the first one, that Earth's challenge had been correct on 14 of the 17 counts. 3 of the remaining counts were classified as ambiguous and referred to an independent review panel. None of them were found in favor of the original proposal. Proposal 7 Alpha 9 was formally withdrawn. The withdrawal was announced by Prethik, the Voth legal counsel, in a session that I attended from my gray-striped seat. He used 9 words to announce it. The session moved on to other matters as though nothing unusual had occurred. That was fine. I wrote those 9 words in my notebook, verbatim, and underlined them once. Following the withdrawal came the restructuring discussions. These were slower, messier, and more genuinely difficult than the legal fight had been, because they required people who had disagreed for decades to agree on something new. The Voth pushed back on the voting weight revisions. The Relian resisted the elimination of observer tier designations until a series of meetings convinced them that the alternative was a chamber with 61 formally allied species presenting a coordinated legal challenge every time a proposal went to vote, which was going to be considerably more time-consuming than reform. The Vel delegate Hannah was a formidable presence in those discussions. So was the Dressy delegation, whose linguistic precision turned out to be exactly the right tool for negotiating the specific wording of the new charter language. I sat in on as many sessions as I was invited to and contributed where I could, and I referred many of the smaller species to Bren, whose document on unused procedural rights had by this point been circulated to every observer delegation on the station. When the new charter language was finalized, it eliminated the observer tier. Every member species would hold a participation seat. Voting weight would be calculated on a formula that included population, voluntary participation contribution, and duration of membership, which was a compromise that gave established powers like the Voth more weight than new entrants, but not the disproportionate control they had previously exercised. It was not a perfect system. Perfect systems did not exist in rooms with 900 different opinions in them. It was, however, a system that had been built according to its own rules rather than around the convenience of whoever happened to be largest. On the morning of the inaugural session, I put on my jacket. I unpinned the gray observer badge from the lapel where it had lived for 11 years. I held it for a moment. The gray rim, the pale designation code, the weight of it, negligible and enormous at once. I put it in my jacket pocket, not in a drawer, not in the archive, in my pocket, where I would be able to feel it. Then I walked to the chamber and sat in a different seat. The seat was not in the gray-striped section. It was not specially distinguished in any way. It sat in the middle tier of the arc, between the Teleri delegation and the newly upgraded Messin seat, and it had a small plaque on the armrest that read Earth in Galactic Standard. The plaque was new. The installation team had fitted it the previous day. I had not watched them do it because I had had other things to do, but Corvell had watched, and he had sent me a message that said, "They used a good quality fixing, it will not fall off." I had laughed at that message in a way I had not laughed at anything in a very long time. Austin opened the session. He looked out at the chamber, at the rearranged seating, at the faces of delegations who were sitting in different places than they had occupied for decades, and his expression was the expression of someone who had just observed something that he would be telling people about for the rest of his career. He called the session to order. I was listed on the agenda, Earth's first address as a full participation member. I had written it over the course of 6 days, which was long for 200 words, but 200 words required more care than 2,000, because every one of them had to be chosen correctly. I had shown the draft to no one except the Secretary General's office, which had sent back a reply from Adrian Cole that said, "Say it exactly like this." When Austin called my name, I walked to the speaker's platform for the second time. The chamber was different from 40 rows back. I had always known intellectually that it would look different from up there, but knowing something intellectually and standing in the fact of it are not the same thing. What I noticed was not the size of it, which I had stood in before, but the faces. I could see them clearly. All 912 seats, and the delegations in them, and the expressions on those delegations. Some of them were cautious, some of them were curious, some of them, in the Voth section, were neutral in the careful way of people who have decided that neutral is the wisest option available. Ysara was watching me. Her dark eyes, independent of each other, were both pointed at me for the first time in 11 years. I held her gaze for a moment, and then I looked at the whole chamber, because I was not here to address anyone in particular. I said what I had prepared to say. I told the chamber that Earth had come to the Galactic Council 31 years ago because we believed that the galaxy was large enough for all of its inhabitants and that what we built together would be better than what any of us could build alone. I said that we still believed that. I said that the events of the past 2 months had not changed that belief. They had, if anything, strengthened it, because what had happened was not a species taking something from another species. It was a legal framework, functioning as it was designed to function. It was the Council's own principles being applied, consistently. We had not asked for anything, we had not already been promised by the documents that founded this institution. I said that Earth's intention was not to be the loudest voice in this chamber. We had no particular interest in dominance, which was a word that implied the diminishment of others, and that was not something we were interested in. What Earth was interested in was a chamber that worked, a place where the size of your fleet was less important than the quality of your argument, a place where the species with the fewest votes could still raise a legitimate legal objection and be heard. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was convenient, but because that was what it said in the founding document that every species in this room had agreed to honor. I said that Earth was grateful to the 63 species who had signed the joint objection. I said that Earth was also grateful to the Council's legal office for conducting its full review, and to the chair for managing a difficult transition with consistency and good faith. I said that Earth looked forward to working in the new structure, and that we expected it to be, on occasion, complicated and contentious and slow. I said that was what governance looked like when it was genuinely trying to represent more than one interest, and that we would take complicated over convenient every time. I said thank you. I walked back to my seat. There was a moment of the same pressurized quiet that had followed my first address. Then a sound began in the lower observer section, which was no longer the observer section but the recently upgraded participant tier, and it spread upward and outward through the chamber, and it was not quite applause because the species present had 15 different traditions for expressing communal assent, but it was the closest the chamber had ever come to one sound. I sat down. I opened my notebook. I wrote the date, the time, and the sound, described as accurately as I could. Corvell, 2 seats to my left, put his hand briefly on the armrest of my chair, not quite touching my hand, but close. It was a Teleri gesture I had learned the meaning of 8 years ago. It translated, approximately, as I am glad we are in the same room. I put my pen down for a moment, just a moment. Then I picked it up again, because the agenda continued. The new charter was ratified that afternoon by a vote of 708 to 93. The 93 were all aligned with the Voth. The Voth themselves split, which had not happened within their delegation in the Council's recorded history. 4 Voth delegates voted in favor. I did not expect it. I wrote their designation codes in my notebook and drew a small mark beside each one. After the ratification vote, the session broke for a station meal period. I stayed in my seat while the chamber emptied around me. It was a habit from years of staying longer than necessary in rooms that other people were eager to leave, because the rooms said different things when they were empty. This one said, "Something changed here." I was still sitting there when a pair of footsteps approached from the Voth section. I did not look up immediately. I had learned not to look up too quickly, because quick looking communicated more than you intended. When I did look up, the figure standing at the end of my row was someone I did not recognize from the senior Voth ranks. He was younger, formally dressed, and carrying himself with the particular uprightness of someone who had been told to do something difficult and had decided to do it correctly. He said his name was Dath. He said he was the newly appointed secondary delegate, which told me that the previous secondary delegate had been reassigned following the charter vote. He said that the Voth delegation wished to acknowledge Earth's contribution to the Council's legal development, and that his delegation looked forward to productive engagement in the new framework. It was the closest thing to an apology that existed in Voth diplomatic language. I knew this because I had spent several months, years ago, learning exactly that fact. I said that Earth also looked forward to productive engagement, and that we were available to discuss any matters of mutual interest at the delegation's convenience. He inclined his head in the formal manner. Then he left. I looked at the empty row where he had stood for a moment. Then I wrote his name in my notebook. The message from my daughter arrived that evening. She was 14 years old, and I had spoken to her on video call twice a week for 11 years, and she had grown from a person who called me Mum and did not fully understand why I was on a space station to a person who followed the council newsfeed and had sent me, on the morning of my first address, a message that said, "They have no idea what they are dealing with, do they?" I had saved that message in 3 places. Her evening message was brief. She asked how I was. She said that her teacher had mentioned the council restructuring in class that day. She said that some of her classmates did not entirely understand what had happened or why it mattered. She said that she had explained it to them. She said that she had told them that her mother had spent 11 years in a room where no one thought she was important, taking notes, and that when the moment came, she had been ready, and that being ready is not the same as being lucky, because readiness is something you build. She said her teacher had asked where she heard that. She said she had told him that she grew up with it. I read the message 3 times. Then I put my terminal face down on the desk, which was something I almost never did. I sat in the quiet of my suite on a space station orbiting a cold blue star, with the stars turning slowly beyond my porthole, and I let myself be, for a little while, not Ambassador Mira Vasquez of Earth's delegation to the Galactic Council. Just a person who had done something that took a very long time and was glad that it was done. Then I picked up the terminal. I opened the message. I began to compose a reply. I wrote, "I am very well. Tell me about your day." I wrote, "I will be home in 4 months. There are some things I would like to explain to you properly, about patience, and about what you can build with it if you are willing to be underestimated for long enough. I think you already understand most of it. But I want to tell you in the same room, at the same table, with the tea that actually tastes right." I wrote, "I am proud of you. I have been proud of you every single day." I sent it. Then I opened my notebook to the next clean page. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I thought for a moment about what to write next, what the right observation was for the end of a day like this one, and in the end, I wrote something simple. I wrote, "Earth stayed silent until it had something worth saying. Now, it has said it. Now we will see what comes next." Before I closed the terminal, I checked the council session archive one final time. The recording of my first address, the 43-minute legal presentation, had been accessed 422 times since the session. That number would grow. I had known it would grow because the chamber sessions were public record, and always had been, and because what had happened in that room was the kind of thing that people who paid attention to galactic politics would need to study for their own reasons, whether they had been present or not. What I had not expected, and what I found myself looking at for a long minute, was that 11 of the most recent accesses had originated from Earth, not from official government addresses, from ordinary network locations. People on Earth, going out of their way to find a council session recording and watch a human being stand at a speaker's platform 40 rows from where she had been sitting for 11 years. I did not know who they were. I did not need to. I also checked a secondary archive that I had never looked at before, The records of Earth's original admission ceremony, 31 years ago. It was a short recording, 11 minutes. Earth's first delegate, a man named Harris Cole, who was no relation to the current Secretary General and who had died before I ever arrived at the station, stood in the chamber and received our observer designation from a council chair who had been in office before I was born. He looked, in the recording, exactly the way I had expected: composed, present, careful, aware that he was doing something significant, unsure of what exactly it would lead to. I watched the 11 minutes. Then I closed the archive. Harris Cole had written one thing in his personal record that had survived in the Earth Diplomatic Archive. It was a single line, entered on his first night aboard Valindra Station. It said, "We are here. Whatever else happens, we are here, and now we cannot be simply ignored." He was right about the first part. It took the rest of us 31 years to make the second part true. I wrote his name in my notebook. Underneath it, I wrote Nora Ellison. Underneath that, Jeffrey Oakes. Then, below all three, I wrote nothing else. Some records did not need annotation. I closed the notebook. I made tea. I looked at the stars. They were exactly where they had always been. We were exactly where we had earned the right to be. That seemed, on balance, like the right arrangement.